Dad, the house is already going on the market.
You already decided?
I didn't need your permission. You're getting old, Dad. This house is too much for you.
Is that what you tell yourself?
I'm doing what's best for the family.
Just sign the papers and let me...
You want me to sign?
Yes.
Then this is over.
My son looked me in the eyes and told me to get out of the house I had spent 31 years protecting. Then he told me something I never expected to hear from my own child. I'm selling it. I asked him why. He didn't even hesitate. Because you're getting old, Dad. You don't need a house like this anymore. Then he said the words that broke something inside me. You've had your life here. It's time for me to have mine. He had already found a buyer, already negotiated the price, already arranged the papers, and he thought I was too old, too tired, and too powerless to stop him. But there was something he didn't know. I wasn't powerless. I was simply trying to decide how much of the truth I should show him, because I had discovered something about the sale just days before he came to me, something that made me realize this wasn't really about the house. My son wasn't simply trying to take my home. He was trying to take control of everything I had spent my life building, and I could have stopped him that very morning. I could have exposed everything. I could have ended the sale before it began, but I didn't. Instead, I looked at my son and told him, "Go ahead." He smiled. He thought his father had finally surrendered. He had no idea why I had just given him permission to do the one thing that could change both our lives forever. And that's when I realized something terrifying. My son wasn't the only one hiding something. And what happened next would reveal exactly how far a son was willing to go to take everything from his own father. Welcome to Vengeful Patriarch, where family betrayal always comes with a price. And the quietest man in the room is often the most dangerous. If you believe respect should never be taken for granted, subscribe now, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why this son wished he had never crossed his father. My name is Robert Hayes. I was 69 years old when my son tried to sell the house I had owned for 31 years. I remember the exact moment I found out. It was a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when an email arrived from a neighborhood real estate alert I had forgotten I subscribed to. A new property had been listed on my street. I almost deleted it. Then I saw the photograph. My front porch, my oak tree, the blue shutters my wife had chosen before she passed away, and beneath the photograph was a price. My house was for sale. I stared at the screen until my coffee went cold. I didn't feel rage at first. I felt disbelief. Then I called my son. Daniel answered on the third ring. "Hey, Dad?" I asked. "Why is my house listed for sale?" There was a pause. Not the pause of someone hearing shocking news, the pause of someone deciding how much of the truth to tell. Finally, he said, "I was going to talk to you about that." That sentence was the first crack. I asked who had authorized the listing. He said, "I did." I asked why. He sighed. "Dad, we need to be realistic." Realistic, that word would stay with me. He told me the property was too large, too expensive, and too much responsibility for me. Then he said he had already found a buyer. I asked him where I was supposed to go. He said he had found a condominium for me. 2 bedrooms, elevator, security, close to everything. It sounded thoughtful until I realized one detail. He had planned my next home without ever asking whether I wanted one. That afternoon, Daniel arrived with his wife, Melissa. They walked into my living room and began talking about the house like a project. Melissa pointed toward the dining room. "This furniture will need to go." I asked, "Why?" "For staging." I looked at Daniel. "Staging?" He nodded. "The buyer wants it empty." I said, "Daniel, this is not your house." He looked at me as if I had said something childish. "Dad, eventually everything is going to be mine." There it was. Not "we'll figure it out." Not "I'm trying to help." Mine. I asked him when he had decided that. He said, "When I realized you couldn't keep doing this forever," then he leaned closer. "You're getting older." I had heard those words before, from doctors, from friends, from people who meant well, but from my son they sounded different, like a verdict. I asked him one final question. "Daniel, what exactly did you sign?" His face changed, only for a second, but I saw it. He had signed something, and that was when I stopped thinking about the house. I started thinking about the paperwork. Because if my son had already signed something, the real story had begun long before that morning, and I was going to find out where it started. Daniel used to ask me for advice. When he was 22, he called me before every major decision. When he bought his first car, he asked me to inspect it. When he started his first business, he asked me how to negotiate. When he got married, he asked me what I thought a husband should protect. Somewhere along the way, those questions disappeared. They were replaced by announcements. I'm buying this. I'm changing that. I'm moving money here. I'm handling it. At first I blamed age. Then I blamed success. Daniel had become successful enough to believe he no longer needed anyone's experience. But the house changed something. He wasn't simply independent. He was acting as if my life had become an asset on his balance sheet. 3 days after I saw the listing, he returned with a folder. "Everything is ready," he said. I asked, "For what?" "The closing." I looked at him. He said, "Dad, please don't make this difficult." I asked him whether he understood what he was doing. He smiled. "I'm protecting the family." That sentence made me angry. I said, "Protecting the family doesn't mean taking someone's home." He replied, "It's not really taking it." "Then what is it?" "It's moving it to where it will do the most good." I asked, "For whom?" He didn't answer. Melissa did. "For everyone." Then she explained their plan. The house would be sold. I would move into the condominium. Daniel would use part of the proceeds to invest. The family would eventually benefit. I listened. Then I asked the question neither of them expected. "Who told you that you had the right to sell it?" Daniel laughed, not nervously, confidently. "You've been talking about succession for years. Succession isn't ownership." "Dad, stop making everything complicated." I looked at the folder. "Let me see it." He pulled it away. No. That single word told me more than all his explanations. He wasn't asking me to trust him. He was asking me to stay ignorant. That night, I went into my study. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was an old blue folder my wife had labeled Home. I hadn't opened it in years. The first papers were ordinary. Tax records, insurance, old renovation receipts. Then I found the document I was looking for. And suddenly I understood why Daniel was so confident. He had information, but he didn't have all of it. Someone had shown him enough to make him dangerous, not enough to make him right. I called my attorney, Margaret Lewis. She had handled my estate planning for years. When she answered, I didn't tell her Daniel was selling the house. I asked something more precise. "Margaret, if someone believes they have authority over property they don't actually control, what happens when they sign a contract?" She went quiet. Then she asked, "Robert, who signed something?" I looked at the old document on my desk. I said, "Not yet." And I realized that 2 words had just changed the entire strategy. Not yet, because stopping Daniel would be easy. Finding out why he believed he could do it was going to be much harder. And if I stopped him too soon, I would never know how deep the betrayal went. The next morning, Margaret came to my house. She brought no assistant, no dramatic briefcase. Just a leather folder and the same calm expression I had known for 20 years. She read the old property documents. Then she looked at me. "Daniel doesn't understand the structure." I asked, "Can the house be sold?" "Not by him in the way he's attempting." That should have made me feel relieved. Instead, I felt something colder. If Daniel couldn't legally do what he was trying to do, why was he so confident? Margaret asked whether Daniel had shown me the buyer documents. I said no. She asked whether he had shown me the contract. Again, no. Then she asked the question that bothered me most. "Does Daniel know about the family trust?" I said, "He knows there is one." "And does he know the exact provisions?" "I don't think so." Margaret closed the folder. "Then someone may have given him an incomplete picture." I asked who. She said, "We need evidence before we make accusations." That was fair. So we started looking. Not at Daniel, at the transaction. The buyer's name appeared on one document. A company called Northbridge Holdings. I'd never heard of it. I searched its registration. The company was new, less than a year old. Its listed office was in a building I knew, the same building where Daniel's business consultant kept an office. That was my first real warning. Then came the second. A payment from one of Daniel's business accounts to a consulting company connected to Northbridge. The amount wasn't enormous, but it was labeled Strategic Advisory. I called my accountant. He told me there had been several payments. I asked why no one had told me. He said Daniel had been authorized to manage certain operating accounts. Authorized. That word mattered. Daniel had taken a limited responsibility and started treating it like ownership. I spent that night going through records. By 2 a.m, I had found several transactions. None alone proved what I feared. Together they created a pattern. Money moved, information moved, people were introduced, and the house suddenly became the final piece. I closed the laptop. For the first time, I wasn't asking whether Daniel wanted my house. I was asking what he planned to do after he got it. The answer came the following afternoon. Daniel called me. "The buyer is ready," I asked when. Friday, I asked who would attend. He said, "You don't need to worry about that." I smiled. He was still trying to keep me outside the room. So I said something that surprised him. "Fine." There was silence. Then he asked, "Fine?" "Yes, I'll sign." He laughed. Good, that one word confirmed what I needed. Daniel thought my surrender was real. He had no idea I had just decided to let him walk through the next door. Friday arrived. Daniel came early. He wore a navy suit I'd bought him years earlier. I noticed that detail. The same suit, different man. He stood in the hallway and said, "You should pack the personal things today." I asked, "Why?" "Because the inspection is tomorrow." I looked at him. He was already dividing my life into boxes. He told me the buyer was an investment group. I asked the name. He hesitated. Northbridge. I said nothing, he noticed. What? Nothing. That was the first time Daniel looked uncomfortable. He had expected an argument. Instead, I asked whether the buyer had seen the old study. Yes. The basement? Yes. That's the problem. He looked at the signed papers, then at Victor, then back at me. You let me sign? Yes. Why? I took a breath. Because if I stopped you before you acted, you could always tell yourself you had never intended to betray me. He stared at me. But you did. I pointed toward the papers. You made the decision. His voice dropped. Dad, I said, you wanted control. He whispered. I wanted a future. I answered, you wanted a future so badly that you decided your father's present didn't matter. The room went silent. That was the moment Daniel finally understood. The sale wasn't the victory. The signature was the evidence of what he had chosen to do. And now everyone in the room knew. But I still had one final decision to make. What would happen to my son after the truth was exposed? Daniel stayed seated after everyone else left. For the first time in months, he looked like my son again. Not the executive. Not the man who had walked into my house without knocking. Not the person who had planned my future without asking me. Just Daniel. He asked me, Did you ever think about stopping me? I said, every day. Then why didn't you? Because I wanted you to make your own choice. He looked at the floor. I thought you were going to give me everything eventually. I said, I probably would have. He looked up. That surprised him. I continued, I spent years preparing things for you. He asked why. Because you were my son. He swallowed. Then what changed? I answered honestly. You did. The room was quiet. I told him I wasn't taking pleasure in what had happened. I wasn't celebrating his humiliation. But I wasn't going to protect him from the consequences either. The house remained protected. The family assets remained under the structure designed to safeguard them. The company returned to the governance arrangements that existed before Daniel tried to take control, and Daniel was removed from the responsibilities he had abused. He wasn't destroyed. He wasn't thrown away, but he was no longer trusted with things he had demonstrated he couldn't handle. That distinction mattered to me. I sat across from them. Daniel raised his glass. To new beginnings, everyone drank. I waited. Then Daniel began speaking. He talked about the house, the sale, the investment, the family's future. He described the changes as if they had already happened. Then he said, My father has decided it's time for me to take responsibility. I looked around the table. My daughter looked confused. One of the older relatives avoided my eyes. Melissa smiled. Daniel continued. This isn't about taking anything from Dad. It's about making sure the family is protected. That was almost funny. Almost. Then Melissa leaned toward me. "You must be relieved," I asked. "Relieved about what?" "That Daniel is finally stepping up." I looked at her. "Stepping up to what?" She didn't answer. Daniel did. "Everything." The room went quiet. I said, "Everything is a large word." He smiled. "Not anymore." Then I asked, "Daniel, did you tell them what the buyer actually wants?" His expression changed. "There's no need to get into details." I looked at the table. "That's interesting." He leaned toward me. "Dad, please." I stopped. Then I said, "Fine." Daniel relaxed, but I wasn't finished. I asked the room one question. "How many of you knew my house was being sold before I did?" Nobody answered. That silence was more powerful than an argument. My daughter looked at Daniel. Daniel looked furious. He stood. "That's enough." I remained seated. He said, "You're embarrassing me." I answered quietly, "No, Daniel." I looked around the table. "You embarrassed yourself." He walked out. Melissa followed. The dinner ended early. But the next morning, Daniel came to my study. He closed the door. "The locked storage room?" He paused. "No." I said, "Why not?" He said, "It's irrelevant." That was another lie. Everything Daniel called irrelevant was becoming important. The buyer's representative arrived at noon. A man named Victor Grant, professional, polite, careful. He shook my hand and said, "Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry this is difficult." I asked him why he thought it was difficult. He looked at Daniel, then back at me. "I assumed you were aware." "Aware of what?" Victor stopped. Daniel interrupted. "Dad, we don't need to discuss every detail." I looked at Victor. "Please continue." Victor looked nervous. He said, "I was told the property was being transferred as part of a broader family restructuring." Family restructuring. That phrase wasn't Daniel's. Someone had prepared a story. I asked Victor who had given him that information. He said, "Your son." Daniel's face hardened. I thanked Victor. Then I told him I needed a few minutes alone with my son. When Victor left the room, Daniel said, "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Trying to embarrass me." I looked at him. "You're the one selling my home." He replied, "You're making it sound worse than it is." Then he said the sentence I had been waiting for. "Once this closes, I'll finally have the authority to make the decisions." I asked, "What decisions?" He said, "All of them." "About the house?" "No." He looked directly at me. "About everything." That was the moment the story changed. The house wasn't the destination. It was leverage. Daniel believed ownership of one property would give him access to a larger structure, but he didn't know the structure had been designed specifically to prevent one person from taking control. I looked at him and said, "Go ahead." His shoulders relaxed. He thought he had won, and I let him believe it because I wanted his signature. Chapter 5. The signature Daniel signed the preliminary papers that afternoon. I watched him carefully. His hand didn't shake. His voice didn't hesitate. He was certain. That certainty bothered me more than the betrayal people who are uncertain ask questions. I agreed. Then they told me Daniel had been asking questions for months, not about the house, about control, who could authorize payments, who could approve transfers, who had voting rights, who could replace trustees, who could change operating agreements. Daniel had been collecting answers, piece by piece. I sat quietly while the information came in. The strangest part was that none of it sounded criminal on its own. That was what made it dangerous. Ambitious people ask questions, executives plan succession, children discuss inheritance. But Daniel wasn't waiting for succession. He was accelerating it, and he had started telling people that I was becoming difficult. One employee told me Daniel had said I was slowing the company down. Another said he had joked that I needed to retire before I forgot what I owned. That one hurt, not because it was insulting, because it was public. Daniel had been creating a story about me while I was still working. He wanted people to believe that anything he took from me was simply the natural transfer of power from one generation to the next. Then I found the most disturbing piece, a draft document that would have changed control over several family assets. It hadn't been executed, but Daniel had reviewed it. Someone had prepared it for him. I asked Margaret whether she knew who. She said we needed more evidence. So we waited, and Daniel kept moving. He arranged a family dinner. He invited relatives, business associates, people who had known me for years. The invitation said, An evening to celebrate the future of the Hayes family. I knew exactly what that meant. Daniel wanted an audience. He wanted to announce his new position. He wanted to show everyone that his father had finally stepped aside. I decided to give him his audience, but I wasn't going to give him the ending he expected. Before the dinner, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror. For a moment, I looked older than I felt. Silver hair, lines around my eyes, a face that had carried 30 years of responsibility. Then I remembered something my wife used to say. "Robert, don't confuse being tired with being finished." I smiled. Then I put on my suit, because Daniel wanted to introduce the future. He had no idea I was bringing the past with me, and the past had receipts. There were 11 people at the table. Daniel sat at the center, Melissa beside him. She asked, "Are you ready to show him everything?" I answered, "No." She paused. "Then what are you ready to show him?" I said, "Enough," because the final lesson would be more powerful if Daniel discovered the truth one piece at a time. Just like I had discovered his betrayal, the final meeting was scheduled for Friday. Daniel believed it was the closing. I knew it was the beginning of the end. He arrived with Melissa. Victor, the buyer's representative, was there. Margaret sat beside me. My accountant was there, and 2 senior people from the business were waiting near the window. Daniel looked around. "What are they doing here?" I said. "They have a right to hear the truth." He laughed. "You're turning this into a spectacle." I looked at him. "You did that at dinner." He sat down. Victor opened the transaction file. Daniel reached for it. Margaret stopped him. "Please wait." Daniel looked annoyed. Then I spoke. "Daniel, before this goes any further, I want you to answer one question." He said, "What?" "Who told you the house was yours to sell?" He looked at Melissa, then at Victor, then at me. "No one." I waited. He said, "I made a decision." "Based on what?" "Based on what I knew." "And who gave you that information?" Silence. I pushed a document across the table. Daniel looked at it. His face changed. It was one of the records from months earlier. A conversation, a payment, a recommendation. The person who had been advising him was exposed. Daniel looked at me. "You knew?" I said. "I knew enough." Then Margaret explained the property structure. Daniel interrupted. "No." She continued. He stood. "No, that's not what I was told." I answered, "People who are certain stop looking." Daniel had stopped looking. He believed the paperwork confirmed everything he had been told. When he finished, he pushed the document toward Victor. Victor reviewed it, then looked at me. I gave him a small nod, not approval, permission to continue. Daniel stood. "That's it?" Margaret, my attorney, answered. "For today." Daniel looked irritated. He asked why there were additional documents. Margaret said, "Standard procedure." Daniel accepted the answer. He didn't know that one of those documents contained a condition he had never considered. He didn't know because he had never read the entire structure. He had read only the parts someone had highlighted. That was his weakness. He trusted information that made him feel powerful. I had spent my life doing the opposite. I distrusted information that made things too easy. After Daniel left, Margaret asked me whether I was sure. I said yes. She said, "You understand what happens if this continues?" "I do." "You may have to watch your son make several more mistakes." I looked toward the front door. "I've already watched him make the biggest one." She asked what I meant. I said, "He thinks I'm fighting for the house." I paused. "I'm not. I was fighting for the truth." That evening, Daniel called me. His voice was excited. "Dad, I think we're finally on the same page." I asked him what he meant. "You're letting go." I said nothing. He continued. "I'm going to make sure everything is taken care of." I asked. "Everything?" "Yes." "Daniel, what exactly are you planning?" He laughed. "You'll see." That sentence kept me awake, not because I was afraid, because I knew he had just revealed something. He wasn't waiting for the sale to finish. He was already planning the next move. So I made my own call. I contacted someone Daniel trusted, someone who had been close to the company for years, and I asked one question. "Has my son been asking about my other assets?" The answer was immediate. "Yes." Now I knew. The house was only the beginning. The person I spoke with asked me not to reveal their name, because revenge, in my mind, isn't about hurting someone more than they hurt you. It's about making sure they cannot keep hurting you. Before he left, Daniel asked, "Can I come back?" I looked at him. "You can always come back as my son." He waited. But you can't come back as the person who tried to control my life. He nodded. Then he walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. Dad? Yes? I really thought you were weak. I smiled sadly. I know. He asked, were you ever afraid? I told him the truth. Yes. That surprised him. Of what? Of discovering that my son didn't love me the way I loved him. He looked away. I continued. But fear doesn't mean surrender. He nodded. Then he left. I stood alone in the hallway. The house was still mine. But that wasn't what I felt proudest about. I was proud that I had finally stopped confusing love with protection from consequences. For years I thought being a father meant shielding your children from the hardest parts of life. Sometimes it does. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let an adult child face the result of an adult decision. Daniel thought my age made me irrelevant. He was wrong. Age had taught me patience. It had taught me that people reveal themselves when they believe they have power. It had taught me to listen when someone thinks I'm not listening. And it had taught me one final lesson. Never underestimate a quiet man who has spent 30 years building something. Because he probably didn't become quiet because he had nothing to say. He became quiet because he learned exactly when to speak. A few weeks later, I walked through the house at sunset. The light came through the same windows. The staircase was still there. The oak tree outside was still standing. The house had survived. So had I. And perhaps that was the real victory. Not that I kept a building, but that I refused to let betrayal decide what the rest of my life would look like. If you have ever been underestimated because of your age, I want you to remember this. Being older does not mean being powerless. Sometimes it means you've lived long enough to recognize the difference between someone who wants to help you and someone who wants to control you. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Vengeful Patriarch. Then tell me in the comments, if your own son tried to take your family home from you, would you forgive him, or would you make him face the consequences? I genuinely want to know your point of view. And if you want another story where an older father is underestimated by his own family, watch the related video on your screen next. Because sometimes the person everyone thinks has lost is the person who has been quietly preparing for the moment everyone else realizes the truth. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you in the next story. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Vengeful Patriarch for more family betrayal and revenge stories. Then tell us in the comments whether Robert was right to let his son face the consequences of his own decisions. You knew? I asked. Knew what? You know something? I smiled. Now you're asking questions. He stared at me. What did you find? I didn't answer. Instead, I said, you should ask yourself what I haven't found yet. He went pale. That was the first time I saw fear, not panic fear. And I knew the final confrontation was getting closer. Chapter 8. The second person the next day, I learned who had been helping Daniel. It wasn't Melissa. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had worked with our family for years. Someone who knew the structure of our assets. Someone who understood the documents Daniel didn't. I won't tell you the name yet. Not because the identity matters more than the betrayal. It matters because Daniel trusted this person enough to act. They had been telling him that my control was weaker than it was. They had shown him selective documents. They had encouraged him to move forward. And they had convinced him that once the house was sold, the rest would follow. When I confronted them, they denied everything. I placed one document on the table. They stopped. I placed another beside it. Their hands folded. Then I said, you can lie to me, but you can't change the dates. That was when the truth came out. Daniel had been planning this for almost a year. The house was supposed to create liquidity. The liquidity was supposed to fund a purchase. The purchase was supposed to create voting power. And the voting power was supposed to give Daniel control over the company. It was a chain. The house was simply the first link I could see. I asked why they thought I wouldn't notice. The answer was painful. Daniel believed you were tired. I closed my eyes, tired, that word again. I'd spent my entire life being the person everyone called when something went wrong. Now the people closest to me had decided that the same experience that made me useful also made me weak. I told them the truth. I am tired. They looked at me. But I'm not blind. That ended the conversation. From that moment, I stopped trying to understand Daniel's intentions. I knew them. Now I needed to decide what consequences were appropriate. I didn't want revenge that would destroy my family. I wanted accountability that would stop the pattern. So I called Margaret. I said, "It's time."